It was supposed to be a fresh start. John Matthews, a retired judge, was looking forward to a quiet, peaceful retirement. With his wife, after decades of grueling legal work, they chose a charming neighborhood, hoping to finally relax and enjoy their home, but little did they know their idyllic new life would soon be threatened by a woman who wielded an iron fist disguised as a set of community rules, a woman who wouldn't stop until she had crushed John's dreams of a backyard oasis. And what made it all the more ironic, Eleanor Whitmore, the HOA president, had no idea who John was, but he was about to make her regret it. John Matthews had been dreaming of retirement for years as a respected judge who had spent most of his career making tough decisions in a bustling courtroom. He was looking forward to the simpler, quieter days ahead after a lifetime of fast-paced legal battles. All he wanted was a peaceful place where he and his wife Margaret could unwind. When they discovered Oakwood Estates, a picturesque, upscale community tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the city, they thought they'd found their paradise. Neat lawns, tranquil streets, and a community that felt like a close-knit family. It was the perfect place to settle down, and after a lifetime of service, they deserved it. But the excitement of their new chapter quickly began to unravel. Little did John know, Oakwood Estates had an unspoken rule: stay out of the way of the HOA president. Eleanor Whitmore, the neighborhood, appeared charming on the surface, but beneath it lay a tightly controlled, often stifling atmosphere ruled by Eleanor's iron grip. She had earned her title through intimidation, manipulation, and an insatiable thirst for control. John didn't know it yet, but Eleanor was about to put his dream of retirement to the test. John's first real encounter with Eleanor happened a few days after he and Margaret moved, and she showed up at their door uninvited and introduced herself with the precision of a corporate executive. There was an air of self-importance about her, one that sent an immediate chill down Jane's spine. Eleanor began listing off the HOA rules in rapid succession, her tone both condescending and inflexible. The acceptable paint colors, the height of fences, the flowers that could be planted. Everything had a regulation, a restriction, or a guideline. She spoke as though she had authority over not just a neighborhood, but over everyone who lived in it. John, ever the diplomat, nodded politely and listened, but something in Eleanor's demeanor put him on edge. It was the way she spoke, as though she was a final word on all matters of community life. There was no warmth, no welcoming spirit, only rules and restrictions. She finished her tirade with one last remark: and remember, I am the one who decides what's best for this neighborhood. Before John could say another word, she turned and left as abruptly as she had arrived. Margaret, standing behind John, gave him a questioning look, but John didn't respond. Something in his gut told him that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Jan had spent decades working long hours in courtrooms, overseeing cases that often seemed to be bigger than life itself. Now it was his turn to enjoy some of the finer things. One of those things was a pool he had always dreamed of, having a backyard oasis, a place to unwind and relax after a long day. He and Margaret had discussed it for years, and finally they decided to make it a reality. They followed all the proper procedures, obtaining the necessary permits, hiring contractors, and making sure the pool design complemented the house and its surroundings. But when Eleanor saw the construction team breaking ground, she was less than pleased. She stormed into John's backyard, arms crossed, and declared that pool isn't allowed. Her voice was sharp and commanding, as though she had every right to dictate what could and couldn't be built in someone else's backyard. Jan, already familiar with the stringent rules of the neighborhood, tried to reason with her. I checked with the city. I have all the proper permits, he explained calmly, but Eleanor wasn't hearing it. It doesn't matter what the city says. Our community has standards, and that pool doesn't fit them, she retorted, her tone dripping with disdain. John, who was usually the picture of Patience felt his blood begin to boil. He had followed every rule, every regulation. He had done everything by the book, and yet here was Eleanor dictating that his personal property wasn't good enough for her precious neighborhood, but John wasn't. About to back down, he smiled politely and assured her that he would continue with the project he had already checked, the HOA handbook, and there was nothing in it that prohibited backyard pools. What John didn't realize was that the simple backyard pool would soon become the battleground for a much larger conflict. Eleanor wasn't used to being challenged, and she wasn't about to let this small infringement slide. What started as a minor dispute over a pool was quickly becoming a war for control over the neighborhood, and Jan was about to find himself at the center of it. A few days after their heated conversation, Joan received a formal notice from the HOA. The letter accused him of violating community standards and demanded that the pool be removed immediately. If he refused, he would face daily fines. The letter was absurd. John had done everything by the book, followed every guideline, and yet Eleanor was now claiming that he had broken the rules. He read the letter over Marv's shoulder and let out a frustrated laugh. This is ridiculous. They can't just make up rules, he muttered under his breath. But as the days went on, it became clear that Eleanor was not going to let this go. The violation notices kept coming, each one citing a new issue. His pool wasn't just a violation, his landscaping wasn't up to standard. His fence, which was identical to the one on his neighbor's property, was suddenly deemed too high. Each letter felt like a personal attack. It wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was clear that Eleanor was out for blood, determined to make an example of John, and he was just getting started. The harassment didn't stop with letters. A week later, John caught two HOA board members creeping along his property, taking photos of his fence and pool. When he confronted them, they claimed they were just conducting an inspection, but Joan knew better. He had seen this kind of behavior before in his courtroom days, people trying to intimidate others to make them feel small and powerless, but John wasn't going to be intimidated. Pretty sure trespassing isn't standard procedure, he said, folding his arms. The two women quickly scurried off, but it was clear to Jan that this was far from over. At this point, Eleanor had made it clear that she wasn't going to stop until John was forced to remove the pool. But what she didn't know was that John wasn't like the others she had bullied before. He wasn't intimidated by her threats or her power. He wasn't going to back down, and Eleanor, frustrated by his resistance, began to plot her next move. She knew she needed to do something drastic to teach John a lesson. What could be more effective than using the one thing people feared most? Law enforcement. Eleanor decided to call 911 and make a false report claiming that JN was trespassing and threatening the safety of the community. She was desperate, and she was willing to do anything to make John feel the weight of her authority. As she dialed 911, she put on her best performance, making herself sound terrified and shaking, all while spinning a tale of harassment and aggression. He's been threatening me and causing trouble for weeks, she claimed. Please send someone before things get out of control. What Eleanor didn't realize was that the officers who responded to the call knew exactly who John was. They had worked with him in the past, and they knew he was a retired judge. When they arrived at his home and saw the situation for what it was, they weren't fooled by Eleanor's lies. They exchanged knowing glances, but instead of confronting John, they calmly walked toward him. One officer, Mark, greeted JN with a relaxed chief. That's when Eleanor's entire world came crashing down. ASD officers stepped out of their patrol cars and began walking toward Jan. Eleanor's face was already turning pale with worry. She had hoped that the arrival of law enforcement would instantly make John's actions seem sinister, that it would give weight to her fabricated story. But when Officer Mark Reynolds and Officer Jennifer Lawson greeted JN as chief, everything about Eleanor's plan began to unravel Mark, who had worked with on for years when he was still on. The bench was calm and composed as if this was just another day on the job. Jennifer, also a familiar face to John, sighed and shook her head. They both exchanged a quick glance there, expressions turning from professionalism to disbelief as they recognized what was really going on. Eleanor, for her part, was now caught in her own lie. The smugness she had once carried so confidently now drained from her face. Her mouth opened and closed as she stammered, unable to fully comprehend what had just occurred. What's going on here? He's the one causing trouble, she protested, but Mark, with a knowing look, interrupted her and turned to John. Chief Matthews, what's all this about? He asked, the casual tone of the question revealing that he had already figured out the situation. The reality hit Eleanor harder than anything else. She had just called 911 on the retired judge, a man with decades of service to the law, and worse, she had made false accusations. This was no longer a simple HOA dispute. Eleanor had just escalated into a legal nightmare for herself. John couldn't help but smirk as he looked Eleanor in the eye, his voice calm yet firm. That's right, Eleanor. I'm Chief Matthews, and I'm afraid you just called the police on the wrong person for the wrong reasons. Eleanor froze, her face turning a deep jade of red. She was trapped in a web of her own making, one where her attempt to use law enforcement as a weapon backfired spectacularly. The officers still standing by made it clear that Eleanor's call was not only a waste of their time, but also a criminal act in itself. Making a false 911 call is a serious offense. Mrs. Whitmore, Jennifer added, her voice steady but pointed. You've now escalated this far beyond the initial issue with the pool. Eleanor's legs felt weak beneath her as she realized the full weight of her mistake. Her defense crumbled completely as she tried to justify her actions. I mean it this way. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood, she stammered, her voice trembling, but the officers weren't having any of it. They were professionals who had seen their fair share of false reports and misuse of power, and they knew exactly what was going on. There was no forgiveness in their eyes, only disappointment. It's not your job to protect anyone by making up stories about them, Mark said, his voice laced with disdain. The situation was now clear to everyone around. Eleanor's abuse of power had reached its peak, and it was only a matter of time before the entire neighborhood would see her for what she truly was. As the officers turned to leave, Eleanor stood in stunned silence. The weight of the situation had hit her like a ton of bricks, but it wasn't over. Yet words spread quickly. Neighbors who had been watching from their windows now gathered outside, murmuring to each other. As a process, what had just happened, it wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about the sheer arrogance and entitlement that Eleanor had shown the entire neighborhood, which had once lived in quiet fear of her, was now fully aware of her overreach. John, the composed figure, took a step back and let Eleanor stew in her humiliation. He had been through countless high-stakes cases in courtrooms, but nothing compared to the power struggle he was witnessing now. Eleanor's panic was palpable. She could feel the eyes of every neighbor on her, and she knew deep down that she had lost. But what she didn't anticipate was the sheer force of the backlash that would follow. One by one, neighbors began to speak up, their voices rising in unison against the woman who had bullied them. For years, homeowners who had once been afraid to question Eleanor now found the courage to voice their frustration. Some had been fined for trivial reasons like an unapproved color on their mailbox or a tree that was slightly too tall. Others had simply been harassed into compliance by her oppressive tactics, and now all of them had the validation they needed to fight back. John stood by silently, watching the tide turn. He wasn't the kind of man to seek the spotlight, but this moment of public reckoning was as Eleanor had spent years building her power through fear and manipulation. But John had something she didn't: the truth. and the truth as always was more powerful than any of her lies. The power struggle within Oakwood Estates was now in full swing as Eleanor's lies continued to unravel her. Once loyal board members began to look at her in a different light for the first time. The cracks in her reign of terror were becoming too large to ignore. The morning after the incident with the false 911 call, Eleanor woke up to a buzzing phone. The news of her behavior had spread like wildfire, and the community was in an uproar. Homeowners, previously too fearful to speak out, were now calling for action. They demanded justice. They demanded a change, and it was no longer just about John's pool. It was about the principle of fairness, about standing up to a bull who had used her position to intimidate others. An emergency HOA meeting was called, and this time it wasn't Eleanor at the front dictating the terms. The room was filled with homeowners who had come to express their frustrations, to demand answers. John, still calm and composed, was there too, but this time he wasn't the one under attack. He was the one watching as Eleanor's empire control began to crumble before her eyes. The board members, once her loyal supporters, shifted uneasily in their seats. Some avoided eye contact with her, while others exchanged nervous glances. It was clear that the tide had turned. Steve Harper, the HOA's vice president, took to the podium. His tone was steady, but the message was clear. We have reviewed the incident involving Mrs. Whitmore's false 911 call, he said, his voice carrying across the room. The board cannot ignore the ethical and legal implications of her actions. Several homeowners have expressed concerns about the way our community policies have been enforced under her leadership, and frankly, it's time for a change. Eleanor, now a shell of the competent woman who once ruled the neighborhood, sputtered, trying to salvage whatever dignity she had left. I only did what I thought was best for the community, she pleaded, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Steve continued, what's best for the community is fairness, respect, and accountability. And Mrs. Whitmore, you have failed to uphold those values. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. It was clear that the community had had enough. Eleanor, who had once enjoyed near absolute control, was now an outcast. Her leadership crumbling under the weight of her own actions. For years, the H had operated as an oppressive force, with Eleanor at the helm, enforcing petty rules and finding homeowners for the smallest infractions. Many residents had silently tolerated her authoritarian ways, fearing that speaking out would bring her wrath. But now John had given them the courage to stand up. One by one, homeowners shared their stories of unfair fines, unwarranted violations, and the constant pressure to conform to Eleanor's ever-changing demands. There was a collect sense of empowerment in the room, and for the first time in a long while, the community was united in its resolve. John's voice, calm but firm, carried through the crowd. It's time we take back control of our community. We have the power to change things, to bring fairness and reason back into this neighborhood. We won't let anyone dictate how we live. His words were met with applause, and for the first time in Oakwood Estates, there was a sense of hope in the air. The mood in the room had shifted from fear to determination. The neighbors, once divided and hesitant, were now standing together, ready to take action. They demanded a vote to remove Eleanor from her position as highway president. The momentum was unstoppable. For the first time in years, the residents were ready to fight for their rights, and they had a new leader to rally behind in John Matthews, the retired judge who had turned the tables on the woman who had held them all in fear. The meeting room fell into a heavy silence as the vote to remove Eleanor from power was about to take place. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on anyone. This was the culmination of years of frustration, of silent suffering under an oppressive regime. The community had finally found its voice, and they were not going to back down. Eleanor sat rigidly in her chair, her fists clenched, but she knew deep down that the result Was inevitable. The votes were cast one by one, and when the final tally was revealed, it was a landslide 22-1 in favor of her removal. The room erupted in applause as Eleanor's grip on the highway dissolved in a matter of seconds. She tried to protest, but her voice faltered under the weight of the community's decision. For the first time, Eleanor was powerless. She had lost her hold on the neighborhood, and no amount of bluster or intimidation could change that. John, standing quietly in the back, observed with satisfaction the battle had been hard fought, but in the end, justice had prevailed. But even in defeat, Eleanor wasn't done. Her desperation and bitterness ran deep, and she wasn't going to let go of her power without one last attempt at revenge. Late one night, John was alerted by his security cameras to movement near his mailbox. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a curious raccoon or perhaps a stray animal, but when John zoomed in on the footage, his stomach churned. It was Eleanor. She was creeping around his property wearing dark clothes, hunched over and attempting to shove something into his mailbox. John's mind raised as he realized that Eleanor wasn't just trying to get revenge on him. She was trying to make a statement. She was attempting to damage his reputation, perhaps even fabricate another false accusation now that she was no longer in power. Without hesitation, John called Officer Mark Reynolds, who had helped him earlier. "Mark, you might want to send a patrol car to my house. Something's going down with Eleanor," he said, his voice calm but firm. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars arrived, and as they pulled into the driveway, they found Eleanor still hovering around the mailbox. The officers, now all too familiar with her history, stepped out. Flashlights cutting through the night. "Ma'am," Officer Reynolds said, his tone stern, "step away from the mailbox." Eleanor froze, caught in the actor. Heart racing in her chest, she spun around, clearly startled, and tried to feign innocence. "I was just leaving a letter." But her excuse was weak, and everyone knew it. The officers quickly checked the mailbox and pulled out the letter that Eleanor had tried to hide. It was filled with threat, revenge lawsuits, and accusations of corruption. It was clear that Eleanor's anger had led her down a dangerous path, and now she had crossed the line. "This is vandalism, Mrs. Whitmore," Mark said, his voice colder than ever. "In harassment, you can't just go around threatening people because you're angry." Eleanor, who had once ruled Oakwood Estates with an iron fist, now found herself on the other side of the law. The officers placed her in handcuffs, and as they led her to the patrol car, Eleanor let out a pitiful whimper. "This is all his fault. He ruined everything," she screamed, pointing at John, who stood silently in the background, watching the final act of her downfall. John didn't respond. He had already seen enough. The neighborhood had seen enough. Eleanor had overplayed her hand, and now she would pay the price for her actions. As the patrol car disappeared into the night, John turned to his wife, Margaret, who had been watching from the front porch. "Well, that's the end of that," he said with a wry smile. Margaret chuckled softly. "I think we can finally enjoy the peaceful retirement now, don't you think?" John nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders, but deep down he knew that the real victory wasn't just about defeating Eleanor. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against him. With Eleanor gone, Oka Estates began to change. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the neighborhood for so long was replaced by a sense of unity and relief. The new HOA board, led by Steve Harper, worked quickly to restore balance. The fines that had been imposed under Eleanor's leadership were revoked, and the rules that had once been used to control people were reevaluated to ensure fairness for all homeowners. The community felt lighter, freer. For the first time in years, residents could speak openly about their concerns without fear of retribution. The bonds between neighbors grew stronger, and a sense of camaraderie blossomed. John, for his part, chose not to interfere with the H's inner workings. He didn't want the spotlight. He simply wanted to enjoy his Home is family and the life he had. Worked so hard to build, but even without seeking recognition, he had become a hero. In the eyes of the community, it wasn't just because of the pool or the battles he fought with Eleanor. It was because he had shown them all that standing up to injustice was possible. He had taught them that a community wasn't just about living in the same space. It was about supporting one another, fighting for what's right, and having the courage to make a stand when things went wrong. As time passed, John's pool became more than just a backyard feature. It became a symbol of resistance, of triumph over adversity. What Eleanor had tried to tear down out of spite and control was now a place where neighbors gathered, shared stories, and built stronger connections. The backyard, once the center of conflict, had transformed into a peaceful retreat, a space for relaxation, laughter, and community. Every time Joan dipped his toes into the cool water, he was reminded of the battle they had fought and won. Together, the pool wasn't just a place to unwind, it was a reminder that change was possible even in the face of adversity. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up now walked past John's house with smiles on their faces. They would wave as they passed, offering nods of approval as if to say, "We're with you. We got your back." The pool, once a point of contention, had become the heart of a neighborhood. People came over to relax, to chat, and to enjoy the new atmosphere that had replaced Eleanor's oppressive reign. It was a quiet victory, but one that would resonate for years to come. Looking back, John realized that the true lesson of this entire experience wasn't just about defeating Eleanor. It was about standing up to bullies in whatever form they took. Eleanor had tried to use fear and control to bend the community to her will, but in the end she had underestimated the strength of the people she had tried to oppress. John had stood firm, and by doing so he had shown everyone that no one, no matter how powerful they seemed, was above the law or the principles of fairness. John's victory wasn't just about winning a personal battle, it was about empowering a whole community to believe in themselves. He had reminded them that they didn't have to live in fear. They could fight back against injustice, no matter how small it seemed at the time. In a world where people often feel powerless against the systems that govern their lives, John Matthews had given his neighbors a gift: the courage to stand tall and demand respect. As he sat by his pool watching the sun set over Oakwood Estates, John smiled. The neighborhood was at peace, and that peace he knew was worth every battle fought. Along the way, the lesson was clear: no one should ever underestimate the power standing up for what's right, because in the end, truth and justice always win.